And so last, I'd like to invite SuzanneVan to the podium to talk about where do we envision implementing these and the challenges you might face in the operational field setting. No, all right.
Okay, thank you. So I'll really be speaking about the operational implementation, but within the context of humanitarian emergencies. So some of the challenges and opportunities that we see. So when I refer to emergencies, I'm really referring to both natural disasters that are as a result of earthquakes and flooding, as well as other emergencies as a result of conflict or a war. So in terms of the overall context for global emergencies, this is a chart from the UNHCR refugee report from 2017, and it shows the total number of global displaced populations since 2007. So we can see here that there was since 2007 to 2012, there was pretty much the same amount of global displaced populations. But as of 2012, we see a net increase and continuing increase up until today or until 2017. And just in 2017, we saw 2.9 newly displaced populations globally. And so right now, or since 2017, there was a record high of about 68.5 million globally displaced populations. And this is actually a 50% increase since 2007 to 2017. So here, this is another chart from the UNHCR report, and it shows the origins and destinations of displaced populations in terms of the largest movements since in 2017. So of the 2.7 or 2.9 million newly registered refugees in 2017, we can see that many of them are coming from South Sudan, the majority, above 1 million, followed by Syria and then Myanmar. We can also see that, this is kind of where they're ending up here in Sudan and Uganda. And from all of these countries, apart from perhaps Syria and Turkey, all of these countries are malaria endemic and also prone to other vector-borne diseases. So we see here kind of a nexus between vector-borne diseases as well as the global displaced populations.
We can ask Thomas to advance too.
Okay. Actually, it's the slide before. Yeah, thanks. So whether populations are forcibly displaced due to war or conflicts, as you can see here in Jerusalem on the top left, or due to other natural emergencies, communities really lose all of their belongings and all of their shelter, and they also lose all of their coping mechanisms while there's an emergency. And so at first, in the early days of a disaster or emergency, populations are often forced to live outdoors or often in makeshift shelters. Here. And in countries that are suitable for vector-borne diseases such as malaria, such situation often results in increased also transmission rates. Especially for pregnant women and children under 5, as you can see here, that often constitutes a lot of internally displaced populations or even refugees. So these are the kind of people that are also at increased risk of death and disease, especially in the early days of an emergency. So if shown effective within this context of humanitarian emergencies, spatial repellents could present an opportunity to protect individuals from vector-borne diseases while inside their homes. So of course, this is not to say that we would be using spatial repellents alone. It is kind of a complementary tool along other interventions, especially other interventions outside of the household. Oops, yeah. So I just wanted to mention here that there are many kinds of shelters, especially in our context of humanitarian emergencies, all the way from the start of an emergency. And so Humanitarian agencies such as CRS redistribute often tarpaulins and other materials to construct kind of basic shelters. So this is in Mali with the internally displaced populations that we're supporting. Then there are more temporary shelters, here again with IDPs in Pakistan this time. And then moving to more transitional shelters. So these are displaced populations or refugees that might be in a given situation, that might be there for an extended period of time. So we're working with the population to try and make the shelters that are still culturally appropriate, but still meet international standards. And the idea is that perhaps if they stay for an even longer period of time, they can use the materials that are in transitional housing to more progressive or even kind of semi-permanent housing. So in all of these shelter types, spatial repellents could be suitable. So this is something that we hope to evaluate next year or the following year. So there are, however, I want to talk about some of the considerations also. I wouldn't call them challenges, but just considerations for spatial repellents in this context of humanitarian emergencies. So the first one, so in the immediate days after the start of a crisis, displaced populations might not have access to intact housing or even basic shelter, so this kind of limits the use perhaps of spatial repellents. And even in temporary shelters, yeah, thanks. Even in temporary shelters are often not suitable to benefit from vector control, such as spatial repellents, depending on the amount of ventilation. So sometimes you might just have a few sticks with just a tarp over it. So that's a consideration to make. If a spatial repellent is appropriate, it might be, but it's just a consideration. Yeah, and just like we're working with ensuring that shelters, that the architecture of shelters are culturally appropriate, it is often good to also ensure that spatial repellents are also have a certain level of cultural acceptance, and that perhaps they're perceived, to have the efficacy that we know that it has for the population. So this is also something to consider, and also hopefully something that we would be part of studying in the future. Next, about supply chains. Supply chains are often broken in emergencies. So that hampers the availability of vector control tools, but especially bulkier tools to reach the populations. But perhaps with spatial repellents that are smaller, lighter, it could be also an opportunity to reach the population in an easier way and perhaps in a faster way as well. I have to mention, though, that there are, in the early days, it is to do exact kind of scheduling in an emergency, that's very challenging. So actually, with the spatial repellent, I know in the last trials, you had to replace it every 2 weeks. That could be challenging in this context. So it's kind of a spatial repellent that could last longer, but would perhaps be better in this kind of context where supply chains are not operational, really. Then in terms of environmental waste, I think my last speaker spoke about that there were millions of plastic sheets in Indonesia. So I think that's a consideration. Just that it is a lot of plastic sheeting. There's a lot of plastic also in African countries, especially. But I think as long as we have a mitigation plan and we look at this and we consider this, I think that's yeah. And lastly, I think this is something maybe we want to talk with all of you about later, but since effectiveness of spatial repellents in this context still needs to be evaluated, the degree of impact or effectiveness that spatial repellents hope to show will be a consideration for implementers and procurers going forward. So there are various kinds of distribution mechanisms for implementation at scale. I think I just want to mention a few here. I'm sure there are more of them. But one would be having a project staff. So this is mostly would be done in perhaps in a trial situation, but can also be done in an operations research situation, where the project staff would go. I think this is what was happening in our trials that we've heard of, go from one house to another and hang up the spatial repellent for the household members. The next would be working with community health volunteers, or actually we work a lot more with hygiene promoters in humanitarian emergencies. So this would be perhaps more of a sustainable way of or mechanism for delivery, as we use them in a lot of other programming or interventions. So they could go and deliver the spatial repellent to a household and actually teach the household on how to set it up and when to change it, etc., and would just be there to monitor and support the use of spatial repellents. Next is the voucher system. So we use this quite a bit also in our emergency systems, but also in other programming such as bed net distribution, whereby households are provided with a voucher that then can be redeemed at a specific location in exchange of a product. So this time would be a spatial repellent. And the advantage of that is that you can also have the place where you're redeeming the voucher be somewhere where refugees would be getting additional services. So that could be at a health center or perhaps at a market. So it also has additional benefits. The next is part of a stockpile, or as we call emergency kits. This is an example of Vietnam from last year. And so once an emergency happens, there's an assessment that happens to see what are the needs, what are the basic needs and most urgent needs of displaced populations. So here we can see very basic needs such as soap and then washing powder, a toothbrush, toothpaste, etc. So it could be an opportunity to also add a spatial repellent to this kind of box and this kind of emergency kit in these situations. And lastly, perhaps this is more, in the long term, down the line, when populations have seen the effectiveness and have the perceived effectiveness to maybe be sold on the market later, kind of in the long term, later down the road. So in conclusion, I think so we've seen that most of the globally displaced populations are actually located in malaria endemic countries. Safe shelters protect and rebuild lives, and if they can be protected by vector-borne diseases, then that's really an added advantage. And while spatial repellents still need to be evaluated for effectiveness in this context, they have the potential to really be used in many different kinds of shelters, also in this emergency context. So challenges and considerations, as I said, needs to be evaluated prior to operational implementation, especially with regards to cultural appropriateness and also behavior change. And also SR spatial repellents can also be used not only during an emergency, but also after an emergency when populations are relocating either back home or resettled somewhere else, or also perhaps they integrate into host communities. So we actually work a lot with displaced populations, not necessarily in refugee camps, but just to work with them that they actually live with the host population. So we've seen many additional benefits from that. And finally, optimal delivery mechanisms still need to be tested, but I think there are many promising options. So thank you.